Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. This is of course that peculiar show where each and every week, we dive into a different album and, just have a chat about different kinds of music and albums, right? So in today's episode, we're of course returning to the wonderful sonic world of Steve Roden with a look at, another one of his long-form compositions that was also released on line imprint alongside forms of paper, of course. And so this album, this has always been one of my absolute favourites from Roden, I feel. It's amongst one of the first few I went to listen to when deciding to dive into his discography many years ago. And it's an incredibly slow and patient album, but to me, it's maybe one of the more emotionally resonating album experiences within Roden's, vast discography. Maybe just to me. In any case, let's just get on with it. I present today Proximities by Steve Roden. And so of course, we're looking at, Proximities by Steve Roden here. A slow-moving minimalist performance, combining a sort of randomised series of tones, alongside gentle, airy drones and the occasional hum from Roden himself. And released on the legendary line imprint, of course, is its 52nd official release in 2011. As mentioned, easily one of my favourite of Roden's long-form composition, and once again, like one of the first I ever heard. When it comes to Proximities, though, I just truly adore, the sort of, somber, melancholy nature that seems to permeate throughout this entire recording. It's one that sort of seems to feel like it's generating a wistful sense of longing and wonderment as we consider our own place in time and, just where we are, what we're hearing, what we're seeing, and how it all just comes together in these, these odd fragments of moments, if that makes sense. And so as we do on our videos on Steve Roden, it's always worth mentioning the accompanying notes that go alongside the album. And mentioned before, I'll mention it again, it just gives us the necessary context for what it is we're hearing. And, especially, why the particulars of the albums and questions sound the way they do. It's important for Roden's music, the process is, as important as the music itself, I find. Sometimes, yeah. And so for Proximities, both on the Bandcamp page and on the back of the physical release here, we're told the following. Proximities was recorded in 2010 during my time as the artist in residence at the Chianti Foundation in Marfa, Texas. I began by recording a performance of a series of tones played on an old battery-powered Piaia Oz that was determined by the letters A-G as found in a text by minimalist sculptor Donald Judd. I recorded the tone sequence several times during sunrise amidst 50 of Judd's stainless steel sculptures in an old army barracks that has been converted into a museum. The performance is recorded with an H4 digital recorder, my iPhone, and also a cheap Sony micro-cassette recorder. During several of the performances, these small devices were emitting the sounds of previous performances from their tiny speakers. At times, I also hummed. All the processing in the recordings was generated by the extremely resonant physical space. The occasional popping sound, which can be heard at the end, are the sounds of Judd's sculpture expanding while the sunrise changed the temperature within the space. So yeah, it tells us everything we need to know about this track essentially. So Proximities, a 42-minute composition from Roden. So what I appreciate in regards to this one, in the explanation, is the explanation to the very process of this album itself. On paper, everything Roden says, it feels almost sort of simplistic, the approach to performing a series of tones on a tiny little keyboard. We'll get to that in a little bit later as well. And its sequence, almost randomly generated by the portion of text by Donald Judd, who also provided the very structures that perhaps informed the very direction of this piece itself, or occupying that same physical space that Roden was in. Of course, when I say simple, it's by no means a dig at the process at all, but for me, rather admiration. Admiration that something that uses seemingly so little can end up having such a large resonating effect when one listens to it. It's perhaps that kind of less is more approach, and just all of Roden's contributions here come together in such, an emotional way, I find, and I think it's perhaps one of Roden's greatest strengths as an experimental artist, perhaps, I also appreciate how Roden allowed the physical space of the room he was in, and perhaps more importantly, the structures by Judd themselves, to just in some ways probably inform and direct the improvisational composition, utilising that room's resonant space as well to expand that musical performance with natural reverberance, through the tiny speakers, essentially. It's very interesting how it just results in this thing that all comes together really well. It's an incredibly slow-moving piece, though, that traverses so patiently with every swell of a tone, feeling like the inhaling and exhaling of large breaths of air. And across this composition, you just get these lengthy drones, all sourced from the various performance of that battery-powered Pia Oz, which is an old portable mini organ from the 70s. And just to talk about it a little bit, it's a delightful little machine with an incredibly limited range of notes, not even spanning 2 octaves, it seems. But as evident on this album itself, clearly more than enough for Roden to just draw so much creativity from. To go back to the composition itself, though, this is one that just fills you with that longing and melancholy, of course. The more it progresses, the more you start hearing the addition of other sounds occupying that very same physical space, whether it be a high-pitched resonant frequency or even the sound of Roden himself humming gently away. And I don't know why, but especially with those little moments of humming, accompanied by that gentle pulsing of drones, accompanied as well by just the sound of the building, the spaces, the architecture, the weighty descent on a singular tone of the mini keyboard that ends up slowly pushing it along, creaking and wheezing it with just a resigned presence. It just makes for something so incredibly beautiful, I find, especially with those vocal hums. I don't know why, but it's just so beautiful hearing it within this composition, I find. What amazes me about this particular album is, how every time I sit down to listen to this one, I always find myself just completely drawn into the entire soundscape that the album offers up. And with it being over 40 minutes length, it's arguably a long one of sorts, but it just always manages to just pull me into for the entire duration of that, placing me in that peculiar sense of stasis for 40 or so minutes. It's a little unusual. And I can think of numerous times when I've gone to sit down and start writing for this very album, this very review that we're trying to do today. And instead of writing, I just end up sitting there, listening to the entire composition instead here. I just always find myself getting pulled into the world of it, and all I want to do is just continue to inhabit it, even long after the composition is ended. And it's one of those things as well where the ending of this whole thing actually kind of gets to me in this little sort of weird existential way. As mentioned in the liner notes for this one, towards the end you do hear the occasional popping sounds sourced from the sounds of Donald Judd's sculptures expanding as the sunrise changed their temperature. And I don't know why, but the very pops resonate with this incredible sense of presence, just adding to that physicality that this entire record offers, I feel. And it just helps to just sort of tie together some of the sort of abstract, the abstract, I feel, of Roden's composition, with the very physical space itself combining with the audio performance, if that makes sense. It astounds me. And I also love as well how at the end it all just fades into this very gentle silence, and as a result of listening to the whole thing, it just feels like you've experienced such a perfect capturing of little fragments and moments of time itself, stretched out for over 40 minutes maybe. it's difficult to really put into words. I'm sorry, but I will try my best to do so. So as mentioned before, death does add a weird context to things, I find, and I think for some reason I find it on Proximities to be one of those cases. Another thing, that I have mentioned before in this review as well. This is one of those very first few albums that I sat down to listen to by Roden. After deciding to check out more of his music, following on from hearing Forms of Paper for the very first time. It was the albums Proximities and the other album released on line imprint Airforms that were the first two I ever went to sit down and listen to, but I actually can't remember which one came first. In any case, both are some of my favourite compositions by Roden, and Proximities was one that always really stood out to me. It's just this incredibly lovely, beautiful, haunting soundscape, I find. And what really intrigued me was this really odd sense of delicate beauty, I find. And as a result, it's just always been one of my favourites, and I find it really interesting. I was able to snag a fresh copy of this. I think it's actually a mint copy of this. I've taken it out the shrink wrap, so no longer anymore. But I was able to source this from Boomcat when they were having a sale on line imprint, and I find myself really lucky to get it for that price. It was amazing. In any case, when it comes to hearing this album, though, in these current days, it feels like a much more different album experience than the one I first heard when I sat down to listen to it many years ago. It's a little weird in how the randomness of those very notes themselves, generated randomly from that text from Sculptor, it's all set by these peculiar microsound rumblings and the minute details of life, and it creates this very melancholy album experience. But within that, those really brief moments of hearing Roden himself, humming away to himself seemingly, and it just really solidifies that beauty in such an existential way for me, and I find it a little sad to hear. Especially those faint little vocals, those momentary fragments of Roden existing alongside these very strange performances. It's hard to put into words, but it just fills me with an existential longing, and to try my best to talk about it, following on from his tragic death, it just adds so much of an odd sort of new context to how the whole thing is perceived, I feel, especially when I sit down to listen to it now. That weighty melancholy just comes back tenfold every time I hear this one, and it is still one of my absolute favourites, I find, but it's a bit of a heartbreaker now, I find. It's very odd to try talk about, I think, but as I said, it's one of my favourites, and I really did want to discuss this one on the show. And so, yeah, I think with that, we might as well just come up to the end of our weird episode of Weird Music there. I'm really glad to have talked about Proximities and return to the world of Roden, because it's one of those albums that's always been in the long list for covering on this mini-series, essentially, and like I've mentioned many times, just one of my favourites. I just always find myself getting pulled into that sad and slow-moving landscape that seems to just pour over with such a weighty sense of melancholy. And I always appreciate albums that sort of achieve this, kind of results for whatever reasons. It can be many reasons that albums come across as emotional and resonating with you. And maybe the tragic death of Roden is what adds a bit of that context, perhaps. And I feel like it certainly ends up creating, maybe unintentionally, this kind of odd sense of perspective that maybe ends up obscuring the work in a little weird way. But it also, that perspective itself is really emotionally resonating as well as a result of the context, I find. It's very difficult to put into words properly, but it's just something I find with certain artists that you have, love and respect, essentially, and it's very weird to really comprehend, I find, but hopefully I've tried my best there. I don't know, I think I've still been a bit rambly today. Like I said, sometimes things are a bit difficult to discuss, but at the same time, I want to celebrate Roden's, celebrate the breadth of Roden's amazing work, as best as I possibly can on this show, because I just truly adore the works of Steve Roden, and I think the best way to celebrate the work of somebody is to just talk about the work of somebody, talk about what you like about their music and stuff, and talk about all the favourites. And there will be many more Steve Roden videos, of course. There's much more I want to talk about, but yeah, I find with this one, a bit of a sad one to listen to, one that really, really gets to me emotionally, I find, but that's kind of, interesting in a weird, beautiful way, maybe. And so, with that, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best. Take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.